Hey everyone. I've been thinking about what's going on with contemporary liberal left activists these days, and I'm trying to get a good sense of what's wrong and the ideas that are circulating within these groups. I'm hesitant to even call some of these people on the left or part of the left because generally their only commitment to egalitarian outcomes is having a diverse professional managerial class within the confines of neoliberal capitalism. Perhaps liberal is a better word. Some other left commentators have referred to these group of people as, quote, the Facebook left, or, quote, the Twitter left. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive critique, but it's just some things that I've noticed. And maybe you've observed or noticed the same things. Let me know. Now, the first thing that characterizes the liberal left activist are the various forms of taking a stand, moralism, and self-righteousness. One of the biggest roadblocks to an organized left is the obsession and the fetishization of taking the moral high ground. There's a couple ways of doing this. Most of the time, it takes the shape of sloganeering or evocative statements on Facebook or on social media. People might say things like, "I'm against racism. I'm an intersectional feminist. Check your privilege. That's anti-black. Listen to women. Black Lives Matter," and whatnot. Now, this isn't to say that, anti-racism, anti-sexism, and combating homophobia and whatnot are unworthy of mention or are unimportant issues. Of course they are important issues. We should be fighting against these things every single day. We should be fighting against racism. We should be fighting against sexism, misogyny, and homophobia. These slogans and lines can draw attention to a particular issue. But high-minded moralism isn't a form of politics. It's militarized begging. It's reducing politics to taking a stand, or for boldly stating, "I'm for the good things, and you're for the bad things." Now, this is strongly connected to self-righteousness and shaming. Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk did a nice episode on purity tests, and what he mentioned was purity of personal story. Kyle is basically describing the dynamics of what liberals and some on the left are doing. Basically, if you're a conservative, or you said some bad things, or associated with racists or sexists or whatever, or even said a joke or something that was insensitive, then you de facto cannot be part of the fight for justice and equality because you've essentially tainted yourself. You've essentially been tainted by your past actions. Kyle is spot on here. This isn't about coalition building. It's not about alliance formulation. It's not about expanding the base. It doesn't matter if the person has changed their views over time or is invested into the project or the movement. It's all about shaming and being morally superior to other people. You'll commonly see this on Facebook and on Twitter. This is an integral part of call-out culture. It's really easy now because of the internet and social media, and there's records of what you've said or done. "Well, Vince, just don't say stupid, racist, sexist things." Okay, of course not. We should be against these things. But just like Kyle Kulinski said, not everyone grows up with the perfect combination of political, moral, and ethical stances. There's going to be a lifetime of learning, and people are going to change and do things depending on what they believe are in their interests. And, people have the capacity to learn and grow and be better versions of themselves. Just because you do one horrible thing in the past, or you've said some, a joke or something insensitive, it doesn't mean that you lack the capacity to change. It's easy and toxic that someone can just pull up old texts, messages, tweets, or posts in social media from years ago to supposedly, demonstrate the person's moral failings or a lack of commitment to principles of justice. Let's take a look at Cenk Uygur, for example. He's done a lot of good things. He's an organizer, he created Wolfpack, he founded Justice Democrats, he's the CEO of TYT, he brings attention to progressive issues, and he's worked his butt off. Now, is he a perfect human being? Of course not. He wrote some pretty misogynistic things on an old blog, and he has long since abandoned that kind of thinking and ideas. Yet time and time again, his detractors bring up that incident in order to minimize his work in the progressive movement or to smear him. Another example is during the 2020 primaries, liberal commentators on Twitter slammed the Sanders campaign for accepting the support of Joe Rogan. Now, I don't really know much about the personal details of Joe Rogan, other than I occasionally watch his podcast here and there. But, supposedly he said some distasteful things in the past. But here's the thing. Joe Rogan is followed by a massive audience, and some of these listeners are, independents, they're conservatives, they might be people that are open to Bernie's platform. And they're people that you should try to coax into your camp. Now, most importantly, Joe Rogan signed on to Bernie's platform, not the other way around. To suggest that Joe Rogan tainted the Bernie Sanders campaign and that Sanders should have not accepted the support is just absurd and pure stupidity. In a nominally majoritarian society like ours, it's important to build a movement of people through shared political interests. People are not going to agree on every single issue. They're going to come from a diverse array of backgrounds. They're going to have different, believe different religions, hold different jobs, and so on. To raise the standard of having to build the perfect political movement with a base that has a 100% clean record of having not done anything that could have been potentially labeled hateful, racist, misogynistic, classist, or whatever is just delusional or in bad faith. Now, the election of Donald Trump emboldened and reinforced this sort of high-minded, self-righteous thinking. It's extremely easy to label Trump voters as irredeemable racists, white supremacists, rednecks, idiots, Trump-tards, deplorables, and so on. What this does is it skirts the difficult but necessary analysis that is needed to understand why and how Donald Trump got elected. And it's more complex than simply labeling Trump voters as a sign of ever-present racism or a resurgence of white nationalism or racial supremacy. Professor Cedric Johnson has a great article on this, and it's titled, "Who's Afraid of Left Populism?" and it has some very useful notes on the Trump victory. I don't want to get too deep into this election thing because it requires its own episode, but what I do want to say is that the election of Donald Trump reinforced this kind of shaming and moralizing and made it very easy to abandon any analysis of capitalist forces, the failure of the Democratic Party, and organizational strategy and tactics. This kind of thinking treats the fulfillment or establishment of moral standards as the political project and places the responsibility on those that have not sufficiently met the standard to change. We're seeing this a lot on Twitter, especially coming from Joe Biden surrogates or even people like Michelle Obama. Instead of providing a plank to progressives, independents, and other voters, it's all about endless shaming and chastising of those who are not in agreement with the neoliberal agenda. Moralists love this kind of shaming and call-out culture because to them, it's evidence of those pernicious attitudes. These sort of call-outs and militant sloganeering and posturing not only give the accuser power, but a sense of holiness. There's a sort of addictive, feel-good attitude that arises from such actions where social capital is gained by making a public display of one's conformation to high standards of morality and the other person's failure. This is magnified in the social media sphere, where one can get constant approval and affirmation by others. It's super easy to just go on Facebook and type an evocative statement like, "Republicans are destroying the country," or "Listen to black voices," or "Trump is a moron," and so on. Moreover, it can make one feel like they're in a position to educate, to tutor, to enlighten those who are not as culturally attuned as the accuser. Some people really like to be in that position where they're in control of what sort of information is disseminated. There's a lot of power and authority in being able to do that. For example, I'm part of a Facebook chat that's devoted to Asian American issues. And there's always a couple of people who have postured themselves as the authentic Asian voice or the moral educators. Now, of course, moralistic ultra-purists need to be able to criticize and shame something or someone in order to feel all high and haughty. This coincides perfectly with the contemporary left's focus on individuals, interpersonal relationships, and group dynamics. Contemporary left liberal activists believe racism, privilege, misogyny, and other forms of oppression or isms exist in everyday life and may even be subconsciously practiced or demonstrated. It's through one simple act, joke, sentence, or quibble that can lead to one being branded as a racist, sexist, homophobe, etc., for the rest of their life. This is how we ended up with popular but absurd concepts like one's positionality within the struggle and the tendency to confer legitimacy based on one's identification of being part of an oppressed group, as well as concepts like white privilege. Now, I don't know how theoretically useful these concepts are, but in terms of building the necessary forces able to counteract the neoliberal assault, it seems to be a barrier rather than an organizational strategy to rally behind. The whole idea of whiteness studies and privilege are central to this, and it's been institutionalized in academics and part of our everyday discussion and conception of politics and culture. These concepts, along with terms like allyship, presume that there are fundamental differences between groups based on identitarian lines, and that a commitment to fighting a trans-historical amorphous racism should be the primary focus of the left. Now, I personally don't think it's helpful to get bogged down with these concepts. It could really ground a movement before it even gets off the floor. And we know that history is not like this. From the New Deal struggles, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the Bernie Sanders campaign, and so on, there's been numerous examples of people with different backgrounds and experiences coming together to advance certain political interests. It's never perfect, never has been, and never will be. So the topic of whiteness studies requires its own episode, so I'll stop here. But Professor Cedric Johnson has a great piece titled "The Wages of Roediger: Why 3 Decades of Whiteness Studies Has Not Produced the Left We Need." It's a fantastic read on the historical conditions that produced whiteness studies and its limitations. Now, there are certain rules to abide by when conducting a meeting or when building an organization. Things like respect, dignity, compassion, empathy, and so on. Yet there is something contradictory within contemporary left liberal activism and politics. There is an emphasis on being inclusive, on being respectful for the fluidity of the identity, and the multitude of different perspectives. But in terms of politics, there's the ascension of identity over things that should matter more, like organizational skill, charisma, communication skills, administrative experiences, leadership, qualities that are important for building any political movement. In today's Facebook left, someone's identity becomes a quality in itself, where whiteness equals privilege, ignorance about racial suffering, wealth, middle-class comfort, indifference, etc., and blackness, sexual orientation, and citizenship status equates to legitimacy, strength, courage, and so on. The person's identity becomes hard-coded and conflated with certain characteristics. It's essentialist to the core. This is how we ended up with terms like cult of the most oppressed or oppression Olympics, because we presume that if someone belongs to a group that is labeled privileged, then they are inherently disconnected, detached, or ignorant about the suffering or the needs of another group, and they shouldn't speak over or should be relegated to being a good ally. Only those who are identified with such a group that is deemed oppressed, or most oppressed, should carry the torch or dictate the terms of the struggle. So on one hand, you have the liberal emphasis on diversity, identity, and fluidity, yet your skin color, sexual orientation, or immigration status somehow hardwired the traits necessary to speak on behalf of others or guide the political project. It's completely absurd. This is counter-solidaristic, because it presumes that there are fundamental differences between social groups which make coalition building impossible, or just coincidental, which is ahistorical. given the realities of what occurred in the labor movement, the New Deal, the civil rights movement, and so on. Lastly, it's anti-democratic because in lieu of relationship building or collective political interests, these anti-solidaristic tendencies fall back on notions of, quote, who can speak for the group, based on identitarian lines rather than an actual constituency that is built through collective engagement or democratic support. Now this is strongly connected with exceptionalism, where minorities and other identity groups besides whites are portrayed as helpless, noble victims repressed by the fundamentally racist white regime. This totally obscures the complexity and the real class relations within these groups. Now it's important to understand how racism, privilege, misogyny, and other isms play in our daily lives. But what's equally, if not more important, is to understand the historical conditions surrounding the development of these ideas and what structures perpetuate and reinforce inequality and other unjust outcomes. Professor Stephen D'Arcy, I'm probably butchering his name, Stephen Darcy, well, he sums it up best when talking about the language of the post-New Left, and how the new vocabulary reflected the defeat of the social democratic tendencies of the civil rights movement, the destruction of the left, and the shift towards interpersonal relationships and group dynamics. Quote, if we are able to defeat colonialism and capitalism, we cannot do so one person at a time, or one interaction or relationship at a time. The systems themselves need to be named, understood, attacked, and overthrown. This issue is, obviously, closely connected to the loss of a focus on liberation. A liberation focus and a system focus share a common understanding that the purpose of the left is to defeat systems of exploitation and oppression. Challenging immediate impacts is important, but not enough. It is necessary, but by no means sufficient. Moreover, the way we challenge everyday impacts should be informed by our understanding that they are not produced simply by individual actions, but by the operation of large-scale systems. End quote. The focus on shaming, moralism, self-righteousness is so attractive in today's climate. It's really easy to lump people into the good side and those onto the bad side. There's a form of truth underneath this. We want to be against racism. We want to be against sexism, homophobia, discrimination, prejudice. And we're committed daily to this fight given the viral, shocking, and reprehensible videos and articles of police violence, racial violence, misery, and brutality in our society. However, as a form of politics, it's horribly inept at resolving the contradictions, material shortcomings, gross inequality, and brutalizing poverty that has ravaged the United States. This form of thinking that is so prevalent among today's activists that focus on interpersonal relationships, the action or inaction of people, and the dynamics between and within social groups obscures the power of capitalism and the class relations that spawn from it. When you have poor and working people of all identities, men, women, straight, gay, lesbian, undocumented, documented, white, black, etc., suffering under the yoke of neoliberalism, then it seems pretty clear to me that we need to focus much more on the structures that cause and reinforce these sorts of negative outcomes. And I suspect that this ilk of thinking functions as a way to justify or eschew an analysis of these structures and dynamics, as well as deflect from the speaker's own relative wealth, income, or power. It functions as a form of activism or politics that shields themselves from culpability and responsibility in the rising tide of misery and suffering. And I hate to generalize, but the most fervent practitioners of such thinking range from politicians like Cory Booker, Hillary Clinton, people like Joy-Ann Reid, Zerlina Maxwell, Tim Wise, down to everyday folk. Even those who are not part of the commentariat or the political and business elite come from relatively well-off backgrounds, went to top-tier schools, are employed at Fortune 500 companies, or have comparative degrees of financial security. Again, not to sound like I'm generalizing, but this is what I've noticed. This ideology, serves not only as a way to hide their privilege and status, but if we were to focus our efforts on class analysis or the dynamics of capitalist relations and market forces, the very same people would be revealed as enablers, benefactors, or accomplices in the neoliberal assault on working people. This sort of thinking protects that status quo from critical analysis and acts as a narrow form of social justice within the confines of capital. These tendencies are not conducive to building an organized left capable of challenging or accumulating power. Just to circle back to my first point about self-righteousness and the focus on interpersonal relationships to try to link it all together. The people who practice this kind of ideology and politics don't have to seriously think about things like organizational strategy or even a critique of the aspects of capitalism. The first reason is the focus on white privilege and concepts like allyship and identitarian modes of leadership. There's a presumptive assumption that we either have to close ranks in terms of racial or identitarian affinity before we can really begin any sort of political project. In addition to this, things like white privilege and allyship assume that coalition building is done only by coincidence or is borderline impossible because of hardwired racism and fundamental differences between ethnic and social groups. This leads to my second point. Due to the inability to ever form meaningful political alliances and coalitions between groups, the only political action that can be carried out is a campaign of moralistic shaming and high-horsing, with the accused needing to repent or show guilt for their crimes of indifference or unsympathy. Only when we've sufficiently reckoned with the legacies of racism, sexism, and homophobia can we unite and mobilize groups for political action. Now this, to me, captures so much of what is wrong with contemporary liberal left activists, or those who subscribe to the dominant discourse on race and politics. There's absolutely no need to think about how to gain power. There's little understanding of the historical conditions that have led us to this point. There's no analysis of how market forces have led to horrific outcomes for all working people, regardless of race and gender. And the reason for this is you can practice this kind of thinking or ideology while accumulating social capital through Facebook likes, Twitter followings, affirmation through social media posts, by simply stating the obvious, tried and true lines on issues like anti-racism, white supremacy, mass incarceration, immigration, and so on. Because this kind of thinking disconnects matters of social justice from political economy, one can be a feel-good moralist while simultaneously participating in the neoliberal assault on poor and working people, and live comfortable lives with high salaries, safe neighborhoods, access to healthcare, and all the trappings of an upper middle-class life. With a tightening of the neoliberal stranglehold over our daily lives, it's important that we think clearly about ways to build solidarity between people of different backgrounds, identities, and experiences based on shared political interests and a commitment to a more just and egalitarian society. No amount of shaming or debates on white privilege or who gets to speak for the movement will formulate the necessary political force to challenge and ultimately take power. There can be no substitution.